Programming is really an art, and I would say that it's actually the real core of any organization. There are places that rely on buildings. I think about some place like Carnegie Hall, the Musikverein in Vienna, the Konzertgebouw. These are places which generate quality in and of themselves. The building themselves are quality, and you're not allowed on those stages unless you present a certain quality. Everywhere else, I judge by programming because that's in essence what the organization is putting out there. My own history of programming goes back really to when I started playing with Pinkas Zuckerman, which would be 1975, still in our lifetime. And we played a lot. One could play a lot in those days. And what I mean by a lot was we would generally have at least half a dozen programs each year. For instance, I remember at one point we had played in Munich every year for 20 years in a row. So what you present as a program becomes really important because to sustain that kind of interest, you have to know what you've played, when you played it, how long ago was it, and have enough repertoire to always come with something new. Those programs I made for 35 years. I then also was the founding director of something called Melbourne Summer Music in Australia, which was a month-long festival in the summer, summer being January. And that involved everything from recitals to chamber music to orchestra to opera. I did 3 years of that programming. I spent 7 years as a special consultant with the St. Paul Chamber Orchestra, where I was responsible for 5 weeks of programs each season. And then being here with the festival 26 years now. So I literally have conceived of not dozens or hundreds, but actually thousands of programs. How does one do that? I'm very, very conscious and extremely adamant about building the festival from the programs and not necessarily the people who are playing the programs. I do try and get the very best people. That's not the question. But the impetus is always the programming. And I look at that in really a layered, complex way. To begin with, there are a certain core element of iconic pieces which we need to present in order. So for instance, a Mendelssohn octet or the Schubert Trout Quintet will be programmed more or less every 2 or 3 years. Not every year, because that would be a little bit too much, but every 2 or 3 years. I then consider all of the secondary composers who aren't those big names, but perhaps who have written masterpieces, 1 or 2, and never again. Those pieces will come up in a certain rotation. I then look at obscure composers. For instance, a whole bunch of composers who we lost in the Holocaust, who were magnificent, who wrote perhaps even many pieces. There's one, Victor Ullmann. I program quite often his third string quartet, which is a masterpiece. There doesn't exist number one or number two. Everything is lost, but number three is great. I also then consider the mix of living composers or recently deceased composers, or let's say composers from late 20th century or even mid 20th century. And I try and make a balance between these 5 centuries of music. The next really important thing is there are several things which I do not do. I do not program birthdays. I don't do, it's the 73rd anniversary of whomever, and let's play a lot of that music. I don't do birthdays. I don't do nationalities. I don't do let's program nothing but Russian music or French music or Italian music or anything like that. I find that that kind of programming is much more geared towards seducing an audience into the concert. And I'm much more interested in how the audience feels when they're walking out of the concert. Being a composer is probably the single most guiding force in how I program. When one writes a piece for an audience, it's never into a vacuum. There are many aspects of composing, but one of the most important ones is to be constantly aware of where you sense the audience is in your piece. I worked once for a year with Harold Prince on a piece, and in our first meeting, something came up and he said, "Marc, I have to tell you something. I bore easily. If you lose me for 45 seconds, I'm gone." And when you write a piece, you need to be constantly aware of pulling the audience along with your train of thought, with your conception of where the piece is going, and leading them through the piece from beginning to end. That's crucial. Otherwise, things don't work. When thinking about an audience for our concerts, I really go to that same place. And I consider, above everything else, what happens to someone coming into our concert, sitting down in the audience, and being there for however many minutes this is going to go. Is it an hour and a half, whatever it is? And how do I make a program which leads them in a sensible way and in a way that I wish them to be led through this concert, so that when they're finished, when the concert is over and they're walking out, I have managed to have a very specific effect on how they're feeling. That's what the experience of a concert should be. And so I consider different aspects of that. For instance, just the most simplistic, the sound. What sound are you going to hear? What instruments are you going to hear? In what order? And what is the effect of that? I sometimes will program let's call them monotheistic programs, where just a string quartet, and that's what you hear. That's fine in a certain context, being very aware that that's what's going to happen. A 1 hour piano recital, the same. I'm not going to throw in a harmonica just to change the sound. But if it's an evening of chamber music, I always try and juxtapose wind instruments, string instruments, piano, voice, and whatever else, percussion, so that you have contrasting sounds that you're listening to. That's on a very basic level. The next thing that I consider is texture. For instance, if we have a program that's going to finish with a big piece by Brahms, I think Brahms, to me, is lush, romantic, heartfelt, thick. The sound of Brahms to me is a thick sound. And so with that, I will look to put something which is contrasting in the feel of the texture, something cleaner, something more sparse, something lighter, something with more clarity. Haydn would be a good example. Bartók would be equally a good example. Two very different sounds to what the Brahms would be. And I think about that throughout all of the programs and how to create an experience which has an audience coming in feeling a certain way and walking out feeling a very different way, but it's calculated. I know exactly what I'm doing to lead them through that experience. And that's a tremendous difference from making programs which are enticing to lead an audience to come to a concert. For instance, something that seems intellectually interesting, but when you actually sit and listen to what the pieces are and how they affect you, you have to keep holding on to this rationale that somehow this is very interesting, but you don't feel it. It's very important to me to have a certain controlling aspect to the whole experience. In order to program in this way, there's a certain kind of give and take which happens in regards to the musicians. So in any given week, I will start with the important, the substantial, and the main highlight pieces of that week that I would like to put on. Think of who I need to put them on. Is it 4-string players, 6-string players, a pianist, a flute, a clarinet, whatever it might be? Start to engage those people and then get into a bit of a dialogue. The dialogue is necessary because of the caliber of the people. When I'm bringing these superstar players, I can begin by saying, I would like you to come this date to that date. I would like you to play with so-and-so and so-and-so and so-and-so. That's all usually quite fine. I can then say, I would like you to play a Brahms piano quintet. That's fine. And then comes the part where, since you're here playing the Brahms piano quintet, and I can ask you to play 3 other pieces during the week, would you consider doing this, this, and this? And most of the time, I would say 90% of the time, I get the other 3 pieces. Some of the time, I will get a reaction to, "Ooh, I really hate that piece. Can I do something else?" And some of the time, I will get something like, "I've always wanted to play such and such." And then there's a little bit of give and take, and sometimes the pieces that are being offered fit nicely in some way or another with the concept of the programs. Sometimes they don't fit at all, and I'll say, "I'm really sorry, but we just can't do that piece. However, if you come back next year, I'll think of a way to do it." And there's a little bit of back and forth arriving at the final program, and that goes on 40 times with 90 people. In the end, I would say I'm quite confident that the real impetus of all the programming is coming from my vision, that the adjustments are made within a relatively small window of that vision. And the most important thing to me is building with these programs a kind of a trust with the audience. There is very little chance that the majority of the audience knows what Beethoven opus whatever numbers such and such is. They don't know what that is. They will recognize Beethoven. They'll recognize Horowitz or Heifetz playing, or Rubinstein or whomever, but they don't know what that piece is. And so there's a lot of trust involved with the sense, exactly in the same way as I spoke about Carnegie Hall. You trust if you buy a ticket to a concert in Carnegie Hall, it's going to be a certain level. Here it's the same thing. After many, many years, this audience has come to trust that if I made the program and I invited the people who are playing it, that it's going to have a certain level, a certain excellence. And I think they've come to understand also that there's always a certain level of unknown and surprise, because part of what I really believe in is not segregating the different centuries of our musical heritage. So I rarely do programs that don't have something unexpected, something surprising, something quite new, or something quite unknown. And again, I'm very, very careful about how I juxtapose those pieces. It's not random. If there's a new piece, it's usually played by the best players. It's usually over-rehearsed to the extent that it's going to be the best performance you can possibly have of that piece. And it will be embedded in a program so that there will be something very familiar, reassuring that you're going to be safe in the concert and nothing's going to accost you unnecessarily. And there is a great deal of value in juxtaposing the unknown with the very well-known, because it gives you context. If you're only listening to older music, you don't understand the context of that music, which at one time was as new, obviously, as anything that we can hear today. And it's important to have that kind of balance. It's important to have an expansion of one's experience in concerts, because otherwise it's known and becomes routine and becomes something with no expectation of surprise or newness or anything unusual.